Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 4th of October and we're looking at new developments on the Kurakhove front in the Battle of Tukurnia further north. Also a lot of changes around Kharkiv. So we're going to get into all of that today, and by the end of the video we're going to discuss in great detail some of the dynamics surrounding Ukraine's recruitment process, some changes they have made, and some changes that they are currently discussing that may have to actually be enacted in order to fulfill Ukraine's desired manpower additions. And so now let's begin by looking at the Uspenivka front, as we can refer to it now. I'll begin with the north because here we have a high-profile video released by the 79th Air Assault Brigade. As you may know, the Russian forces have spent the past week or two consolidating positions just south of Kurakhove. They have been able to gain very strong footholds in the local ravine. I think it's called the Sololenaya ravine over here, marked with these red rectangles, and it just gives them a route through which to send in their armored companies to push into the southern outskirts of the village. So you can see here an advance amounting to 0.8 square kilometers, and then the video released by the 79th, which shows an assault and the damage that was caused to 5 armored vehicles, 1 tank, and 1 Desert Cross. They were destroyed by a combination of grenades dropping drones, but primarily FPVs. The assault was carried out using 9 armored vehicles carrying infantry and 1 tank. In total, the Ukrainians claim that 20 Russian soldiers were killed, and they show proof for some of them, and then also 23 wounded. The ones that are killed usually don't occur due to the direct contact between the FPV in the tanks or armored vehicles. It happens because once those vehicles get disabled, they are out in the open. So you have Russian infantry getting out, running into nearby tree lines, in some cases even houses like you saw over here in this southern tip or the warehouses. And then they got picked off by drones dropping grenades individually. And that's how the casualty rates rise. But it is also confirmation of Russian boots on the ground reaching all the way to this part of Kurakhove. Clearly, the Russians have been able to open up a vector that allows them to reach inside, albeit each time they do take losses and are eventually repelled. But these are only for a temporary period of time before the next assault comes in and advances another couple of kilometers deeper. And that is all being done with the goal of attacking from the south, really in order to prevent having to attack directly from the east, which is something they've been successful in avoiding because they have this different route that the Ukrainians weren't as prepared for, and that the Russians have certain advantages in because, again, it's a different dynamic, not directly through one narrow corridor. Also, the Russians, they are advancing from positions marked in X that are generally overlooking the chain of villages around Kurakhove, which is on a really low-lying valley. And the fall of such a village would play a role in precipitating advances along this paved road going northwestwards towards Uspenivka. So that's a really important Russian priority moving forward. But let's go down and look at what's going on with the aftermath of Vuhledar yet again. You can see here an update from Deep States as of today, an advance of 4.6 square kilometers. The Russians are just consolidating control over large swaths of fields that the Ukrainians simply are now holding on to. Even within the very fortified apartments of Vuhledar, there are already large issues with fully staffing them and holding on due to desertion. So you can imagine how much more difficult it would be to hold on to positions here in open fields that barely have any trenches, that are just totally disconnected from the rest of the Ukrainian rear. So inevitably, no Ukrainian soldier actually wants to stay here and dig in. They've all retreated regardless of what orders they get from the higher ups. 2 positions around Bokhaevlenka. There are basements here, so it is more safe. Or even further north to some of the other nearby villages, leading all the way to Uspenivka in the north. That's sort of the connection between the 2 parts of this front line that are really active right now, that you can see me marking in red. So as a result, the Russians are filling the void in these open areas. A lot of them are actually located on relatively high elevation, as you see me marking in X. And those provide the perfect platform for armored assaults towards Bokhaevlenka, which, again, through this axis that you see, the current yellow advances is really not defended. The Ukrainians did not prepare with trenches in this area, and the forces that are going to here, they're doing so after getting fatigued in the aftermath of a really difficult withdrawal where a lot of their comrades were killed or wounded, the ones that made it out on foot, so they were exhausted. A lot of their vehicles that were initially involved in rescue attempts were damaged or destroyed. And so all in all, for the units here from the 72nd Brigade, they are not in a state to really conduct more protracted defensive operations in settlements the size of Bukhaevlenko, which is relatively large. And so the Russians are, of course, going to capitalize on that, given they do still have the operational capacity to continue with these several kilometer deep advances in a relatively short period of time. 72nd Brigade actually have 7 battalions attached to it, as was acknowledged by Ukrainian journalists and also militaryland.net. They showed that on their website. The issue is so many of them have just been diminished. They lack any infantry at this point. So it means that only the battalion headquarters is standing, and you have, of course, the rear elements for logistics or medical, transport, whatever it may be, mechanics. Those people are not actually fighting in the line of contact unless they're taken out of their actual roles and sent there to fill in any gaps. And so you can't really call it a battalion that has any sort of effective fighting force. You might as well just disband the battalion entirely and move the support forces to help out with other battalions that are suffering shortages in those specific areas. And even in the best case scenario, for some of the battalions that do still have infantry, their sizes are still really not up to standard for a Ukrainian unit based on what it should be on paper, where it should be, 800, 900. I guess it depends on the size, but in theory, upwards of 1,000. In reality, almost no battalion is actually that size, sometimes because the battalions are split up into smaller forces. And so sometimes it's logical, sometimes instead it's 600, and there could be a rationale if there was like a third or fourth battalion created in the brigade. But then in other cases, like here, you have battalions that are fighting in the line of contact that only have 350 men, and then their platoons, they are maximum 30 men fighting in the front line, usually only 14 to 18 for a platoon. Platoons could be upwards of 50, so you're looking at less than half of what they should be. But yeah, a lot of this I already mentioned. Something that I did not comment on is the integration of the 123rd Territorial Defense Brigade, a unit that for years now has been on the Kherson part of the front line. And as a result, really did not suffer that many losses. They should have maintained their core, albeit it is an inexperienced unit and the caliber there is just very low, given the fact that it was relegated to that area. Now it's actually being moved to a heated part of the front line, and its forces that were not willing to be sent in to help the 72nd hold on and eventually evacuate. They just refused to do so. So 72nd Brigade themselves, some of the elements in Vuhledar, they had to stay behind. They were not able to retreat on foot, and they did so in order to help their other members that were part of the defensive garrison actually have a bit of breathing space to retreat, because the Russians, they were able to infiltrate really, really quickly into the garages in the northwestern part of the settlement and also the northeastern points. So they had these very good firing positions looking at the Ukrainians as they were withdrawing. So you did have to maintain a small force, perhaps a couple dozen Ukrainian soldiers that basically sacrificed themselves either by getting killed in battle or being taken POW in order to allow the rest of the Ukrainian forces, several hundred of them, to withdraw. And that speaks to the discipline of the 123rd. But now they're going to be here, and they're going to have time to get acclimated with the situation and get involved with future defense for this area, just to really fill the void of all these huge losses that the 72nd Brigade suffered. Looking directly east of Kurakhove, we have a slight Russian advance south of Kurakhove, amounting to, what is that, 0.9 square kilometers. Again, this is an area that is not that well defended. It's well defended in the sense that you have several battalions of air assault forces, whether it be 79 or 46, that do have strong, some would say also artillery components, but definitely drone components that are raining down fire and on any groups that are trying to go from tree line to tree line or any armored assault. And that's prevented a head-on Russian advance through this highway all the way to Kurakhove itself. But again, not many static positions, so you don't have the Ukrainian paratroopers holding on here at any given time. They're much further westwards in those trenches or in Kurakhove itself. And then that creates a sort of distance from the front line, which the Russians can obviously exploit if they were to ramp up their assault operations here. And it would only get worse if the entirety of Uspenivka was taken over, because then the Russians would have this very strong frontline base with actual houses there to begin attacking southwards and get control over the highway and also some of the nearby heights, because there are some hills, I believe, around here and also here, just overlooking the highway and the entrance to the Kurakhove itself. The Ukrainians on paper control, but in reality, they're not really sending in large quantities of squads to hold on a daily basis to these regions. When they are, it's in small numbers, and most of the fighting is going on from the sky. Looking a bit northwards, you see here a large advance by the Russian forces. It really is just a consolidation of previous Ukrainian retreats, as reported on by Deep State. It's a 11 square kilometer piece of territory, and it means the Russians are now really closing in on Zelane Druhe. It means they have full control over Zelana Persha, maximum advance of 3 kilometers southwards. Druhe, I suppose it's important because it's the final village in this red rectangle that you see over here that remains under Ukrainian control east of the Vavcha River. So it acts as a conduit between the rear, if you could even call it that here, and it's not really rear, but just a bit westwards, and the remaining squads that are located on the eastern bank. So now the Russians are very close to cutting that portion off. And then you just have this really open area, some tree lines, but not many well-built fortifications that act as just a buffer in order to prevent the Russians from directly reaching towards the western bank, towards these really important settlements located in a higher elevation that are also under threat of being enveloped from another direction, slightly to the west, which we'll get to now by looking at the Sukhornia section. So over here, you have a Russian advance amounting to, what is that, 0.8 square kilometers, pushing even deeper into the village. Again, it's a relatively small one, but the Ukrainians are putting in a lot of resources to drag out the fighting. So you have 25th Airborne Brigade with 1 battalion here. You have several other elements like the tank battalion of the 59th Brigade. Some units here that may or may not be involved. There's not enough verification based on footage, but they are in the general vicinity of this area. Then you could see me marking them on my map. And so they're dragging out the fighting, especially in this sort of eastern portion where the Russians are pushing through house to house. So you have from October 4th, Ukrainian FPV strikes and grenade drops onto Russian soldiers that were able to cross through the tree lines here. So they were targeted while doing that, and then actually made it into the houses. They made it in also to basements, and they were struck in the basement openings. Some of them actually located under warehouses that were also decimated. So that's just additional confirmation of the Russians gradually pushing eastwards here, with the Ukrainian confirmed control really centered around the rail line and the positions west, which the Russians have still not dealt with. But their next objective will be advancing past the rail line, as they've already been able to reach it to the north. The goal now will be to just completely take over the western positions, and then that would give them a really strong salient to advance southwards along this particular rail axis with all these windbreaks. And that would create a wide-scale crisis for the supply situation in Kharkiv and various other cities. I've talked about this now extensively in every single video, and I'll continue to, because just the way in which the battlefield is unfolding, it is really looking that way based on all dynamics we're seeing. And I really called it very similarly in previous Russian advances that occurred towards the Vavcha River. So I'm just going to continue honing in on that point so until people remember it. But now, in regards to the Chasiv Yar area, there is a bit of confusion because some Russian sources allege that there was a push slightly westwards, getting control over additional forests near Stupochky, taking over local squad positions of the 5th Assault Brigade. On the other hand, I saw reports discussing Ukrainian counterattack that was organized that repelled the entire Russian garrison that is west of the Donbass Canal and basically retook control over the forested region over here. Neither one of those reports can be confirmed, so I'm not really going to change it either way. But a lot of the forested regions here have been decimated by the artillery and FPV strikes. Again, still the coverage here is very good, and that's why the Russian DRGs decided to advance through here, but it is being diminished after years of just constant bombardment destroying the leaves here that are supposed to be growing. Now, when it comes to the Kharkiv front, a lot of developments going on over here. It's not as covered as what's going on in Donetsk, but it is just as important when you're looking at the broader situation in Oskil. So we're going to zoom in and break it down one by one. Here you can see west of Andriivka, the Russians have already taken over the entirety of the village. Here, the extent of the advance amounts to 7 square kilometers, so it is a large gain. It means the Russians are very close to reaching the next chain of villages, which starts in Vishneve and then moves southwards to Pershtravneve and Kopanki, also leaving Nadia, in that case, in a encirclement from the north. So there's a lot of pressure that could be put onto these very small villages. Again, there are Ukrainian outposts here, but they are just minuscule in size in each individual section. Of course, together they make up rather large garrisons, but if you take them out like piecemeal, as has been done by the Russians in a lot of these assaults on villages, they are able to divide and conquer. That's what we see here. You can see how the Russians that organized in Kolomichicha, they decided to just bypass Mizhorivka entirely and go for one village. And then at that point, that would create a situation where the remaining Ukrainians in the salient, they'd be squeezed out just by no choice of their own. It'd just not be tenable to hold on over there. So that's the sort of strategy the Russians are going with over here. And the objective is to just continue pushing through some of these lower lying areas until they eventually reach the trenches over here. The goal will be to infiltrate them, but first they have to reach those areas in the first place. And these trenches have not really been tested. We don't know how strong they are, if they're being manned properly, if they will stand up to very significant bombardments, for instance. But yeah, we could look at that in the future. Additionally, in Stupochky, this is an area where there's been battles raging for several weeks now, actually starting in August when the Russians made their initial breakthrough from the west. Now they've taken over the southern chunk of the village, amounting to 2.1 square kilometers. You can see it means the Russians are really consolidating positions along this low-lying river valley area, which will be very difficult for the remaining Ukrainians in the region, whether they be located in bulges south or north. And what it means is the Russians would now have a forward operating node, which really branches out, you could say, 6 kilometers westward before you reach the next Ukrainian organized settlement, because that's really what they're relying on here, because they don't have many static positions. The ones that are here, they're going to be rained upon by Russian drone crews, which are active around here, artillery, cab strikes. There were a lot of cab strikes actually on Pokrovsk over the past day, 9. Interestingly, head of the Pokrovsk local administration said that 80% of the critical infrastructure was damaged in the city as a result of a lot of those cab strikes and other strikes. That's just tangent, but in regards to this area over here, it means that you have a very large opportunity to conduct a two-pronged attack, because you have this Ukrainian garrison. It's not large per se, but it is taking up a large swath of territory that is coming under pressure from two pincers. You could see, for instance, the Pischane pincer over here, which is moving southwards, and then from Selmakivka. And you see it's an area that is, it's a pretty wide, but also it's open. There's not a lot of defense positions here. There's not a lot of geographic positions that make huge and quick armored assaults difficult to repel. Really, the only thing holding on to it are the Ukrainian troops themselves and their defensive capacity. And so there is a big fear that they'd be able to then cut off whatever Ukrainian troops are trying to just maintain some semblance of a solid front line by holding on to this very, very deep salient, basically trying to keep the Russians at the rear from reaching the front line in bulges like the one over here, and from reaching battles like Selmakivka, just keeping them tied up in deeper areas like Berestove or Pischana itself. That's the objective. And because the quantity of the Ukrainian soldiers doing that is pretty small, there is then the threat of opening up and then being exposed from the rear for those Ukrainian defenders. And as a result, to sort of counteract that, you have the 17th Tank Brigade moved in. Some of its elements were around the northern border in Volchansk. Now it's here and it's providing actual tank support to repel any sort of Russian assaults in this case. But you can see in yellow that the Russian advances have only continued, and they're continuing on a near daily basis in this region, especially southwest of Pischane, where you just see a huge blooming of the Russian advance. In this one particular area, it's 1.8 square kilometers taken, and it's really being done with the nexus being around forested areas and ravines. Because there are not many defendable positions here, there is a possibility of opening up and then advancing another 6-7 kilometers southwards to Lazova before reaching the next actual trenches, and putting a lot of stress onto these Oskil River Valley villages that you see over here, like Kurakhove, which again is holding, but look at how narrow the difference is between the Oskil River and the crossing and where the Russians are. That's simply not tenable. There's no depth over there. Same thing with, what is this, Kolesnikivka. You can see Russian advance here amounting to 2.25 square kilometers. And again, it's reaching its easternmost entrance. That's going to be very difficult to hold on to in the long term unless the Ukrainians can organize a temporary counterattack in this region. But so far, we've not seen enough indications to say that they are planning such a thing. Of course, it could change in the future. The most high-profile Ukrainian counterattack that has occurred in this region was around I believe, mid-August, and it was over here. You could see 12th Azov Brigade before they were moved to the New York area, making it all the way to the entrance of Novovodiane. But even then, they were not able to enter actually into settlements. Their extent of their advances really amounted to open fields and forested regions near the chain of villages the Russians were using to launch their assaults. Now, looking at Vovchansk, there is an issue here with the mapping because you can see the Russian red polygon. I can't edit it. I click on it and you don't see any dots, so I can't move it around and show shifts in the front line. As a result, there's overlap between the Ukrainian polygon and the Russian one, but you should know that there are no Russian forces present in the Vovchansk aggregate plant. The Ukrainians took it over in a counterattack. And since then, there's actually been efforts by the Russians to re-enter because they understand the significance of having such a massive outpost. It provides domination of the remaining parts of the northern bank of the Vovcha River, which the Ukrainians have really been able to hold on to tooth and nail. 57th Brigade, they're involved with repelling the Russian assaults. As I said, here you can see just one geolocation from a large-scale Russian assault, which included basically 2 companies worth of vehicles and troops advancing southwards. Obviously not 2 companies worth of troops, but it's saying from a vehicle perspective, they used over 12 MTLBs in the assault. So the numbers are actually higher in terms of the number used. But in terms of damage, 7 MTLBs were destroyed, film destroyed, and 4 were damaged. Other ones that were involved were able to withdraw before getting targeted by the 57th Brigade's FPVs. The thing is, a lot of this region that is around Solona Street, because that's the main road reaching downtown Vovchansk, a lot of these structures are just completely leveled or have suffered so much damage that it means it's easier for vehicles to withdraw because, they don't get stuck in obstacles and natural obstacles because they've already been flattened. And then it allows those vehicles to get out of the harm's way in a faster manner. But the ones that were actually trying to go back near Kokostova streets and advance southwards into the factory, they were unable to do so. The Ukrainians do retain control over that area, and it does imply, based on the route of the assault, that this region east of Solana Street is currently in a gray zone. We don't know what's going on with this apartment complex further north. Russians, as you recall, they tried assaulting deeper and deeper into it and did so under the support of airstrikes, but simply it wasn't enough. There was not enough of support for those forces, not enough reinforcements, as the Russians moved in a large chunk of their territorial motor rifle regiments away from here to engage with the Kursk defense and then counterattacks. But in this case, with the localized Russian counterattack towards the aggregate plant, this was done by the 82nd Territorial Motor Rifle Regiment. And finally, just a quick look at a change to the order of battle in the Kursk region. Based on this video here, not this one, or actually it is, yeah. This is from the 1st Tank Brigade. It shows their FPVs hitting 2 Russian BMD-2s, causing them damage using FPVs. This is important because it means another Ukrainian unit has been moved to support the operations here. 1st Tank Brigade, it has battalions split up between the Velika Novosilka sector, also did have some presence around Kharkiv recently. Really has been a force moving to and from critical areas, providing armored support where it's crucially needed. Now it's being moved to here, probably to engage face-to-face with the Russian armor that is involved with the large-scale advances that occurred earlier on in the month, last month actually, by the VDV. And so now they're actually here. And that's why the 17th Brigade was probably moved into the Luhansk area just to sort of create or fill that void. And so, yeah, that's all that for today. Thank you all so much for watching. If you guys really want to hear in detail about the troop situation for the Ukrainians, which I thought I would have time to do, but I just don't, then tell me. And I'll save a large chunk of the end of the video just to discuss articles written by the Ukraine's Pravda and by the Times, which I found very informative about the manpower situation. But that's all I have for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys later. Goodbye.